On the morning of June 6, 1944, 225 American soldiers approached a fortress that military planners had deemed virtually impregnable. Rising from the churning waters of the English Channel stood cliffs nearly 100 feet high, sheer walls of rock and clay, topped by German machine gun nests and concrete bunkers. The men in those landing craft had trained for months to climb these cliffs under fire, and now, as dawn broke over Normandy, they would discover whether their training had prepared them for what waited above. An intelligence officer who had studied the position offered a grim prediction. 3 old women with brooms, he said, could keep the Rangers from climbing those cliffs. By the time relief forces reached them, 2 days later, fewer than 75 of those original Rangers would still be capable of fighting. This is the story of one of the most audacious military operations ever attempted, and why it succeeded when every calculation said it should have failed. To understand what happened at Pointe du Hoc, you must first understand why this particular piece of French coastline mattered so much to the Allied invasion plans. This rocky promontory jutting into the English Channel sat roughly 4 miles west of Omaha Beach and 4 miles east of Utah Beach, positioned like a dagger aimed at the heart of the American landing zones. Allied intelligence had identified it as perhaps the most dangerous German defensive position on the entire Norman coast, and the reason was terrifyingly simple. Perched atop those cliffs, ranging from 85 feet to over 100 feet in height, depending on the exact location, the Germans had installed a battery of 6 French-made 155mm guns. These artillery pieces possessed the capability to hurl shells nearly 12 miles in any direction. From their elevated position, they could strike both American landing beaches simultaneously. They could rain destruction on the invasion fleet anchored offshore. A single battery of these guns, properly employed, possessed the firepower to disrupt or even doom the entire western flank of the Normandy invasion. The guns themselves carried a history stretching back to the Great War. Originally manufactured by the French as the Canon de 155mm Grande Puissance Filou, these artillery pieces represented the most powerful mobile field guns of their era. After France fell in 1940, the Germans captured hundreds of these weapons and pressed them into service for coastal defense. They redesignated them as the 15.5cm K 418F and distributed them to batteries along the Atlantic Wall. Each gun weighed over 25,000 pounds and required a trained crew of artillerymen to operate effectively. The shells they fired weighed nearly 100 pounds each and could penetrate the armour of landing craft or destroy infantry concentrations with devastating ease. The German defenders had constructed an elaborate fortress to protect these weapons, massive concrete casemates, their walls several feet thick, had been designed to withstand aerial bombardment from the heaviest Allied bombers. The position included underground ammunition bunkers, crew quarters, an observation post with commanding views of the Channel, and a network of trenches connecting the various defensive positions. Minefields ringed the perimeter. Barbed wire created overlapping obstacles that any attacker would have to breach. Machine gun nests provided interlocking fields of fire designed to sweep the cliff top and cut down anyone who managed to reach the summit. The garrison included approximately 200 men, with roughly 85 artillerymen from the 2nd Battery of Heeres Küstenartillerieabteilung 1260 and about 125 infantry from the 3rd Battalion of Grenadier Regiment 726, part of the 716th Infantry Division. Allied planners understood that neutralizing these guns was essential to the success of Operation Overlord. They had tried bombing. Between April and early June of 1944, Allied aircraft conducted multiple raids against Pointe du Hoc, dropping hundreds of tons of explosives on the position. The raids cratered the landscape and destroyed surface installations. but those concrete casemates had been engineered to survive exactly such punishment. They had tried planning for naval bombardment, but the admirals understood that shelling alone could only suppress the battery temporarily. Once the guns of the fleet shifted to other targets, the German crews would emerge from their bunkers and resume firing. The only way to guarantee the destruction of those guns was to put soldiers on top of that cliff, find the weapons, and destroy them with explosives placed directly into their mechanisms. The question that consumed the planners was how to get soldiers up those cliffs, while German defenders fired down at them from above. The man selected to solve this impossible problem was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a 34-year-old Texan who had transformed himself from a high school football coach into one of the most respected combat leaders in the United States Army. Rudder was born on May 6, 1910, in the small town of Eden in Concho County, Texas, a community so small that it barely registered on most maps. His father was a farmer, and young James grew up understanding the value of hard work and determination. He attended Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College, where he played center on the football team and earned a reserve commission through the Reserve Officers Training Corps. After graduation in 1932, he had coached football at Brady High School before returning to Texas A&M as an assistant coach. When war came, Rudder entered active duty and rose rapidly through the ranks, eventually taking command of the 2nd Ranger Battalion in July 1943. Rudder's Rangers, as they came to be known, represented an elite within an elite. The Ranger battalions had been created specifically to conduct the most dangerous operations the war could offer, missions that conventional infantry units could not reasonably be expected to accomplish. The 2nd Battalion had been activated on April 1st, 1943, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, and from its first days the training regimen was designed to break weak men and forge the survivors into something extraordinary. The Rangers ran obstacle courses while carrying full combat loads. They made forced marches of 25 miles or more in a single stretch. They practiced hand-to-hand combat until they could kill silently and efficiently with knives, garrotes, and bare hands. They learned demolition techniques, small unit tactics, and the art of operating independently behind enemy lines. The preparation for Pointe du Hoc took the Rangers across the Atlantic to the rugged coastline of Britain. At the Commando Training Centre at Achnacarry in Scotland, they learned from British instructors who had been conducting raids against occupied Europe since 1940. These commandos had tested their techniques against German-held coastlines from Norway to France, and they passed their hard-won knowledge to the Americans. Along the cliffs of the Isle of Wight, the Rangers practiced scaling sheer rock faces with ropes and grappling hooks, learning to move quickly up vertical surfaces while carrying weapons and equipment that added 30 or 40 pounds to their body weight. They climbed in daylight and darkness, in fair weather and foul, until the movements became automatic reflexes that required no conscious thought. At Swanage on the Dorset coast, they rehearsed amphibious landings on beaches that resembled what they would face in Normandy. At Bude in Cornwall and Braunton in Devon, they conducted live fire exercises and refined their assault techniques. By the spring of 1944, the Rangers had practiced the Pointe du Hoc assault so many times that every man knew his role by instinct. The equipment they would use for the assault represented a combination of British innovation and American improvisation. The primary climbing apparatus consisted of rocket-propelled grappling hooks that could be fired from the landing craft to carry ropes to the top of the cliffs. Each assault boat, a British-made Landing Craft Assault, or LCA, carried 6 rockets arranged in 3 pairs mounted at the bow, amidship, and stern. The first pair of rockets trailed plain 3/4-inch ropes. The second pair carried toggle ropes fitted with wooden crossbar footholds that would make climbing easier. The third pair supported rope ladders. Steel grapnels topped each rocket, and the Rangers tied lengths of burning fuse to these grapnels. The hope was that German defenders would mistake the burning fuses for explosives and stay back from the cliff edge rather than risk cutting the ropes. The Rangers also planned to employ 4 amphibious trucks known as DUKWs, each mounted with a 100-foot extension ladder of the type manufactured by the Merryweather Company for fire brigades. These ladders had been specially constructed for the assault, with hand-operated pull mechanisms to extend them to their full height. Platforms at the top of each ladder would allow Rangers to provide covering fire with Vickers machine guns while their comrades climbed the cliffs below. Additionally, each LCA carried portable tubular steel extension ladders made of 4-foot sections that could be assembled into a single ladder over 100 feet long. If the rocket grapnels failed, if the DUKWs could not reach the cliff base, the Rangers would still have options for getting to the top. Despite the intensive training and innovative equipment, military planners harbored serious doubts about whether the assault could succeed. The intelligence officer who predicted that 3 old women with brooms could stop the Rangers was not engaging in empty pessimism. He was stating what the mathematics of the situation seemed to indicate. Defenders firing down from elevated positions held an inherent advantage over attackers exposed on open ground below. The Rangers would have to cross a fire-swept beach perhaps 30 yards wide, reach the base of the cliffs while under direct observation and fire their grappling hooks accurately while being shot at, and then climb straight into the teeth of German defences. Every phase of the operation offered opportunities for catastrophic failure. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the American ground forces for the invasion, later wrote that no soldier in his command had ever been wished a more difficult task than the one assigned to this provisional Ranger force. Rudder refused to be deterred by the skeptics. When his superiors suggested that perhaps a less experienced officer should lead the assault while Rudder remained offshore to coordinate the overall Ranger operation, the colonel made his position clear. He was not going to ask his men to do something he was not willing to do himself. He would go in with the first wave, and he would climb the cliffs alongside his Rangers. This decision, seemingly straightforward, had profound implications for what would follow. Rudder's presence on the ground during the most critical moments of the battle would provide leadership that no radio communication from a command ship could have duplicated. The assault force was organized into 3 distinct groups with carefully coordinated missions. Force A, under Rudder's direct command, consisted of companies D, E and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, totaling 225 men, loaded onto 12 landing craft assault and 4 DUKWs. They would attack Pointe du Hoc directly, scale the cliffs, destroy the guns, and establish a defensive perimeter. Force B, a single company of Rangers under Captain Ralph Goranson, would land separately at Omaha Beach near the village of Vierville-sur-Mer to secure the right flank of the main beach assault. Force C, comprising companies A and B of the 2nd Battalion, plus the entire 5th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, would wait offshore for a signal from Pointe du Hoc. If Rudder's men successfully scaled the cliffs and secured a foothold, Force C would follow them in as reinforcement. If no success signal came within 30 minutes of the scheduled landing time, Force C would divert to Omaha Beach and attack the German defences there instead. This contingency plan would prove fateful. The naval bombardment of Pointe du Hoc began in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. The battleship USS Texas, a veteran dreadnought mounting 10 14-inch guns in 5 turrets, opened fire at 5:50 in the morning. For over half an hour, the Texas pounded the cliff-top position with the heaviest shells in the American naval arsenal. 255 rounds of 14-inch ammunition slammed into the German fortifications, each shell weighing over 1,400 pounds and capable of creating craters 30 feet across. The explosions could be seen for miles, their flashes illuminating the pre-dawn darkness like artificial lightning. The bombardment reshaped the very terrain of Pointe du Hoc, collapsing portions of the cliff face and creating an almost lunar landscape of overlapping craters. At 6:24, the Texas shifted its fire to other targets as planned, and an eerie silence descended over the promontory. The Rangers were still 46 minutes from landing. Those 46 minutes would prove critical in ways no planner had anticipated. A navigation error by the lead boat had caused the assault flotilla to drift approximately 3 miles east of its intended course. The small craft were fighting against a strong eastward current and reduced visibility from smoke and haze created by the bombardment. The guide vessel, a motor launch designated ML-304, was equipped with radar that should have prevented such an error, but the combination of challenging conditions and human mistake led the flotilla toward Pointe de la Percée rather than Pointe du Hoc. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell of Company D recognized the error from photographs he had studied during training. The silhouette of the promontory they were approaching did not match the images burned into his memory. He alerted the command boat, and Lieutenant Colonel Rudder ordered an immediate course correction. The turn back toward the correct objective cost precious time that could not be recovered. Fighting against the current, the landing craft made slow progress along the coast. Instead of landing at 6:30 as the operational plan specified, the Rangers would not reach the beach beneath Pointe du Hoc until 7:10, 40 minutes behind schedule. During that 40-minute delay, the Germans atop the cliffs had time to recover from the bombardment, emerge from their bunkers, and man their defensive positions. The carefully calculated timing of the assault, designed to put Rangers on the cliff top before the defenders could fully reorganize, had been thrown completely off. The delay had consequences that extended far beyond giving the Germans time to prepare. The 30-minute deadline for the success signal passed while the Rangers were still churning through the waves toward the beach. Force C waited offshore, their radios tuned to receive the code word that would bring them in as reinforcement. Lieutenant James Eichner, the Ranger communications officer aboard one of the assault craft, tried repeatedly to transmit the signal, but the message never got through clearly. The only words that reached the waiting ships offshore sounded like Charlie, possibly a garbled fragment of what Eichner was actually transmitting. Without confirmation of success at Pointe du Hoc, Colonel Schneider followed his orders and diverted Force C to Omaha Beach. Rudder's 225 men would have to accomplish their mission without the 500 reinforcements they had been counting on. The approach to the beach beneath Pointe du Hoc was a nightmare of fire, water, and death. German defenders atop the cliffs opened up with machine guns and rifles as the landing craft came within range. The flat-bottomed British LCAs pitched and rolled in the heavy swells, making it difficult for the Rangers to return fire effectively. One craft, designated LCA 860, took on water in the rough seas and swamped before reaching the beach. It went down carrying Rangers from Company D, including men who had trained for months for this moment. 4 Rangers drowned in the frigid channel waters. Most of the others were eventually rescued by a patrol craft and returned to England, suffering from hypothermia and unable to continue the mission. A supply craft carrying reserve ammunition and equipment also sank, taking with it material the Rangers would desperately need in the hours ahead. One of the DUKWs carrying the precious fire brigade ladders took a direct hit from German 20mm anti-aircraft fire and sank with its crew. These light automatic weapons, originally designed to shoot down aircraft, proved devastatingly effective against the thin-skinned amphibious vehicles. The remaining 3 DUKWs made it to the beach, but immediately encountered a problem no one had anticipated. The bombardment that had cratered the cliff top had also torn up the beach, and the heavy vehicles could not cross the broken ground to reach the cliff base. The 100-foot ladders that were supposed to provide the rangers with an easy route to the top proved useless. What happened next became the stuff of military legend. As the surviving landing craft ground onto the narrow strip of beach beneath the cliffs, the rangers scrambled over the sides and began firing their grappling hooks toward the cliff top. The scene was chaos. Bullets cracked overhead and thudded into the sand. Shell fragments from German mortars whined through the air. The roar of explosions mixed with the shouts of sergeants trying to organize their men. Many of the ropes, soaked heavy with seawater during the rough channel crossing, failed to carry their grapnels the full distance to the summit and fell back in tangled heaps on the beach. German defenders leaned over the cliff edge to cut the ropes that did catch, sawing through them with bayonets or knives before the rangers could begin climbing. Some Germans dropped grenades over the edge, sending deadly fragments, showering down on the men below. The rangers fought back with everything they had. They fired their rifles and automatic weapons at any German who showed himself above, forcing the defenders to take cover rather than cut ropes. The destroyer, USS Satterlee, a sleek vessel mounting 5-inch guns, maneuvered dangerously close to shore to provide suppressing fire, its shells exploding among the German positions with devastating effect. The Satterlee's captain risked running aground on the rocky bottom to bring his weapons within effective range, and his gunners delivered fire support that saved countless ranger lives. Despite everything working against them, the rangers began to climb. They used whatever worked. Some pulled themselves up the ropes that had caught and held, climbing hand over hand while their boots scraped against the muddy cliff face. Others assembled the tubular steel extension ladders and began scaling them section by section. Some found that the bombardment had actually helped them in an unexpected way. The massive explosions had weakened the cliff face and sent tons of rock and earth cascading down to the beach, creating piles of debris at the base that reduced the effective climbing distance by as much as 40 feet in some places. The craters blown in the cliff top provided cover for rangers who reached the summit, shelter from German fire that the flat ground of the original terrain would not have offered. The first rangers reached the top within minutes of the landing craft touching the beach, though the bulk of the force took considerably longer, perhaps 15 to 30 minutes before most of the surviving climbers had made it up. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell reached the summit despite having been shot through the right side during the landing. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his torso without hitting any vital organs, but the wound was serious enough that many men would have sought medical attention and withdrawn from the fight. Lomell was not many men. He was a 24-year-old who had grown up in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, and had worked his way up from private to platoon sergeant through demonstrated courage and competence. He refused to let the wound stop him. Alongside Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, he began moving inland to accomplish the primary objective of the mission. What the Rangers discovered when they reached the gun casemates shocked them to their core. The massive concrete emplacements that had been constructed to protect the 155mm guns were empty. Instead of deadly artillery pieces capable of destroying the invasion fleet, the Rangers found wooden poles painted to resemble gun barrels, decoys designed to fool Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The carefully planned assault, the months of training, the men who had already died on the beach and the cliff face, all of it had been aimed at targets that were not there. For a terrible moment, it seemed that the entire operation might have been for nothing. Lomell did not accept this outcome. The guns had to be somewhere. The Germans would not have gone to the trouble of installing decoys unless they had real weapons to hide. Rather than returning to the command post to report the empty casemates, Lomell continued moving inland with Kuhn, following a sunken lane that led away from the cliff-top position toward the French countryside beyond. The lane was bordered by thick hedgerows, the famous boscage of Normandy that would cost so many American lives in the weeks to come. Moving carefully to avoid German patrols, the two sergeants pushed deeper into enemy territory. About 200 yards from the cliff edge, hidden in an apple orchard beneath camouflaged netting that concealed them from aerial observation, Lomell discovered what he had been searching for. 5 of the 6 German guns stood in a carefully prepared alternate position, their barrels aimed toward Utah Beach, their ammunition stacked nearby and ready for use. The weapons were fully operational, ready to fire on the American soldiers landing miles to the east. Approximately 100 German soldiers were gathered about 100 yards away, apparently reorganizing after the bombardment, completely unaware that 2 American Rangers stood within throwing distance of their artillery. What Leonard Lomell did in the next few minutes may have been the single most consequential individual action of the entire D-Day invasion. Working quickly and silently, acutely aware that discovery would mean instant death, he and Kuhn approached the first 2 guns. Each Ranger carried a single thermite grenade as part of his standard equipment, the weight having been carefully calculated to balance climbing ability against destructive capability. Lomell placed thermite grenades into the recoil and traversing mechanisms of the first 2 guns. The thermite would burn at over 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt and weld the precision-machined steel parts into immovable lumps. He smashed the sights of all 5 weapons using the buttstock of his Thompson submachine gun, wrapping his field jacket around the weapon to muffle the sound. Without functioning sights, the guns could not be aimed accurately even if the Germans somehow repaired the other damage. But Lomell was not satisfied. He and Kuhn returned to the Ranger positions near the cliff edge, gathered all the thermite grenades they could find from their comrades at a roadblock they had established, and made a second trip to the orchard. On this second mission, Lomell placed thermite grenades on the remaining 3 guns, methodically destroying their traversing mechanisms, elevation gears, and breech blocks. By approximately 9:30 on the morning of June 6th, the guns of Pointe du Hoc had been destroyed, not by the massive naval bombardment, not by the coordinated assault of 225 Rangers, but by 2 sergeants who refused to quit when the obvious objective proved false. Separately, a patrol from E Company found the 6th gun and destroyed both it and a large ammunition dump, causing explosions that rocked the entire area. Sergeant Frank Rapinski led this patrol, and his discovery completed the mission that had brought the Rangers to these cliffs. Every one of the German guns that had threatened the invasion beaches was now permanently out of action. The Rangers had accomplished their primary mission, but their ordeal was only beginning. Their orders called for them to move inland and establish a roadblock on the highway, connecting the towns of Grandcamp and Vierville, cutting off German reinforcements from reaching the landing beaches. For the next 2 days, they would defend a shrinking perimeter against repeated German counterattacks while waiting for relief forces that seemed never to arrive. The German response came quickly and with overwhelming force. Colonel Thomas Trevor, a British liaison officer who had accompanied the Rangers to observe their techniques, later recalled that night with stark honesty. Never, he said, had he been so convinced that he would be either a prisoner or a casualty by morning. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment from the 352nd Infantry Division launched the first organised counterattack on the evening of June 6th. These were not the static garrison troops who had manned the cliff-top defences. The 352nd Division was a combat-experienced formation that had been moved into the Normandy area only weeks before the invasion, and its soldiers understood how to conduct offensive operations against prepared positions. Throughout the night of June 6th and into the early morning hours of June 7th, the Germans probed the Ranger perimeter, testing for weak points and attempting to find gaps in the defensive line. The fighting that night was desperate and often hand-to-hand. Sergeant Frank South, a 19-year-old medic from F Company, later recalled that the Germans ignored the Red Cross markings on his helmet and armband, shooting at anything that moved regardless of its status under the laws of war. The Rangers had lost much of their ammunition when their supply craft sank during the landing, and they found themselves running critically short of everything they needed to continue fighting. They had no mortars heavier than 60 millimeters, nothing capable of matching the German artillery that began ranging in on their positions as darkness fell. They scavenged weapons and ammunition from fallen Germans, turning the enemy's own rifles and machine guns against him. They shared what little they had, redistributing ammunition to the positions facing the heaviest attacks. Lieutenant Eichner became a critical figure during the night battle, though not in the way anyone had expected. During the assault on the cliffs, Eichner had found himself buried up to his waist in debris when part of the cliff face collapsed around him. A German soldier had looked down at him, but the enemy's rifle was clogged with mud and would not fire. Eichner later described the moment with dark humour, calling it a hell of a note to find yourself in. Now, when the Rangers' field radios failed or proved unable to reach friendly forces, Eichner improvised with a different skill set. He had brought a World War I vintage signal lamp, essentially a large flashlight with a shutter for sending Morse code. Using this primitive device, he established communication with the USS Satterlee, which remained on station offshore throughout the battle. When German counterattacks threatened to overwhelm the Ranger positions, Eichner blinked out targeting coordinates in Morse code, and the destroyer's 5-inch guns replied with salvos that shattered the attacking formations. A message from Rudder reached the naval vessels offshore during the night, located at Pointe du Hoc. Mission accomplished, need ammunition and reinforcements, many casualties. The response from V Corps headquarters brought no comfort to the embattled Rangers. No reinforcements available. All Rangers have landed. This was technically accurate since Force C had already gone to Omaha Beach, where they were fighting their own desperate battle, but it meant that Rudder's men would have to hold their position with whatever they had left. The heaviest German attack came at approximately 3 in the morning on June 7th. A concentrated assault struck the Ranger perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously, the kind of coordinated night attack that requires experienced troops and competent leadership. An entire platoon from E Company was overrun during this assault. 19 Rangers were killed or captured in the space of a few terrible minutes. The line buckled, but did not break. By 4 in the morning, the surviving defenders had been pushed back to a final perimeter centered on Rudder's command post, a tight defensive circle perhaps 100 yards across that represented their last chance to hold the position. Fewer than 50 Rangers remained capable of fighting, and their ammunition had nearly run out. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder himself had been wounded twice during the battle. A bullet struck his thigh during the initial assault on the cliffs, and shell fragments caught him later during the German counterattacks. Both times he refused evacuation, both times he remained at the most dangerous points of the perimeter, directing the defense and providing the moral leadership that kept his men fighting when lesser units might have broken and run. His presence among them, wounded like so many of them, refusing to quit like all of them, gave the Rangers something to hold on to beyond mere tactical necessity. Small reinforcements trickled in during the battle, each group of fresh soldiers representing a small miracle of determination. On the evening of June the 6th, Lieutenant Charles Parker led 23 men from the 1st Platoon of A Company, 5th Ranger Battalion, across the flooded lowlands from Omaha Beach. They had fought their way through German positions for miles, guided only by the sound of gunfire from Pointe du Hoc. Parker's arrival brought not just fresh rifles, but fresh hope, proof that the Rangers had not been completely forgotten. On June 7th, Major Jack Street brought approximately 60 more men in landing craft that threaded their way along the coast past German positions, delivering desperately needed ammunition along with reinforcements. These additions helped stabilize the perimeter, but the Rangers remained badly outnumbered. Relief finally came on the morning of June 8th, D+2. Elements of the 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment from the 29th Infantry Division, along with additional Rangers from the 2nd and 5th Battalions and armour from the 743rd Tank Battalion, broke through the German lines and linked up with Rudder's battered command. The relief force found a scene of devastation that defied description. Craters pockmarked the cliff top like the surface of some hostile moon. Bodies of Rangers and Germans lay intermingled in the trenches and shell holes. The survivors, many of them wounded multiple times, still manned their positions with captured German weapons, their faces blackened with smoke and exhaustion, their eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much combat in too short a time. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at Pointe du Hoc on the morning of June 6th, the casualty toll was almost beyond comprehension. The 2nd Ranger Battalion suffered 77 killed, 152 wounded, and 38 missing or captured across all its D-Day operations. At Pointe du Hoc specifically, fewer than 75 of the original assault force remained fit for duty when relief arrived. The remainder had been killed, wounded too severely to fight, or captured during the German counterattacks. The casualty rate exceeded 70%, a figure that would have been considered catastrophic for any conventional military operation. The question of whether the Pointe du Hoc assault was worth such terrible losses has occupied historians ever since. Some have argued that the guns could have been destroyed by other means, that continued aerial bombing or naval gunfire might have accomplished the same result without sending 225 men up those cliffs to their probable deaths. They point out that the guns had already been moved before the Rangers landed, suggesting that the position might have been neutralized through less costly methods. Others counter that only Lomell's discovery of the hidden guns and their immediate destruction guaranteed that they would never fire on the invasion beaches. The Germans had moved those weapons specifically to protect them from bombardment, positioning them in a location that aerial reconnaissance had not detected. Had Lomell and Kuhn not followed the wagon tracks to that apple orchard, had they reported the empty casemates and waited for orders, the German artillery crews might have manned those guns and opened fire on Utah Beach during the most vulnerable hours of the landing. The consequences could have been severe, potentially catastrophic. The historian Stephen Ambrose, who interviewed hundreds of D-Day veterans and wrote extensively about the Normandy invasion, offered a striking assessment of Lomell's contribution. He described the First Sergeant as the single individual, other than General Dwight Eisenhower himself, most responsible for the success of D-Day. This judgment may contain elements of hyperbole, but it captures something essential about what happened at Pointe du Hoc. The institutional plan had failed in important ways. The navigation error had delayed the landing by 40 crucial minutes. The guns had been moved from their expected positions. The reinforcements had diverted to another beach. The Germans had counterattacked with forces that outnumbered the defenders. What saved the mission was not the plan, but the initiative of individual soldiers who adapted to circumstances and accomplished their objectives through determination, courage, and an absolute refusal to accept failure. The Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc received recognition appropriate to their extraordinary achievement. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed on an American military unit. 14 Rangers received the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions during the assault, including Lieutenant Colonel Rudder and First Sergeant Lomell. Many more received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. These decorations acknowledged what the survivors already knew, that they had participated in something that transcended ordinary military operations. The immediate aftermath of the battle was not a time for reflection or celebration. The Rangers who could still fight were reorganized and sent back into combat almost immediately. They participated in the liberation of Grand-Camp-les-Bains and continued fighting across Normandy as the Allied forces expanded their beachhead. Later in 1944, the 2nd Ranger Battalion would face another seemingly impossible cliff at the Battle of Hill 400 in the Hurtgen Forest, suffering casualties nearly as severe as those at Pointe du Hoc. The battalion surgeon who had treated the wounded at Pointe du Hoc and survived that terrible fight would be killed in the Hurtgen, a reminder that the war continued to exact its toll long after D-Day faded from the headlines. The site of the battle itself became a permanent memorial to what happened there. The French government recognized the extraordinary significance of this ground and took steps to preserve it for future generations. The craters and bunkers remain visible today, protected and maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission as a testament to the Rangers who fought and died on those cliffs. A granite memorial shaped like a Ranger dagger stands atop one of the German bunkers, its blade pointing toward the sky from which the Rangers' enemies had once looked down. Visitors can walk the same ground where Rudder's men made their stand, can look over the cliff edge to the beach below and try to imagine what it must have been like to climb that wall of rock and mud while Germans fired down at them. 40 years after the battle, on June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan came to Pointe du Hoc to commemorate the anniversary of D-Day. His speech that day, written by Peggy Noonan, a 33-year-old speechwriter who had joined the White House staff only 3 months earlier, became one of the most memorable orations of his presidency and one of the finest speeches in American political history. 62 surviving Rangers sat in the audience as Reagan addressed them directly, their lined faces testimony to the 4 decades that had passed since they climbed those cliffs. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," the president declared, his voice carrying across the windswept promontory. "These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The phrase entered the American lexicon, a summation of what the greatest generation had accomplished on the beaches and cliffs of Normandy. Reagan's words connected the men sitting before him to the boys they had been, bridging the gap between the elderly veterans of 1984 and the young Rangers of 1944. Leonard Lomell lived to see that commemoration and many more. He returned to the United States after the war, earned a law degree, and built a successful career as an attorney in New Jersey. Like many combat veterans, he rarely spoke of his wartime experiences for decades, preferring to focus on building a life rather than reliving the nightmares of combat. But in his later years, as the ranks of D-Day veterans thinned and the danger of their story being forgotten grew, Lomell became an advocate for preserving the memory of what the Rangers had accomplished. He served as a consultant for the film Saving Private Ryan, which depicted a version of the Pointe du Hoc assault in its dramatic opening sequence. He gave interviews to historians, journalists, and documentarians who sought to understand what had really happened on those cliffs. He was inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame in 1994 and continued making public appearances to speak about D-Day well into his 80s. He died on March 1, 2011, at the age of 91, having outlived most of his comrades and having ensured that their story would not die with them. A Veterans Administration outpatient clinic in Toms River, New Jersey, now bears his name, a permanent reminder of his service to his country. James Earl Rudder followed a different path after the war. He remained in the Army Reserve while building a career in education and public service in his native Texas. He served as the Land Commissioner of Texas and later as the 16th President of Texas A&M University, where he presided over a transformation that turned the formerly all-male military institution into a modern co-educational university. He died on March 23, 1970, at the age of 59, before many of the commemorations that would honor the men he led. He was inducted posthumously into the Ranger Hall of Fame in 1992, and the university he loved named a building complex in his honor. Years after the war, Rudder returned to Pointe du Hoc with his son to see the cliffs he had climbed on that June morning. Standing at the base of the promontory, looking up at the sheer walls of rock and clay that rose toward the sky, the former Ranger commander shook his head in disbelief at what he was seeing. "Will you tell me how we did this?" he asked. "Anybody would be a fool to try this." It was crazy then, and it is crazy now. The question contained its own answer. The assault on Pointe du Hoc had succeeded not because it made tactical sense, not because the equipment worked perfectly, not because everything went according to plan. It had succeeded because the men who attempted it refused to accept failure as an option. When their grappling hooks fell short, they found other ways to climb. When the guns were not where intelligence said they would be, they searched until they found them. When they ran out of ammunition, they picked up German weapons and kept fighting. When relief failed to arrive, they held their ground until it did. They did not fight because the odds favored them. The odds were terrible, and every man in those landing craft knew it. They fought because the mission mattered, because the soldiers landing on Utah Beach were depending on them, because their country and their cause demanded that those guns be silenced. This is perhaps the most enduring lesson of Pointe du Hoc. War rarely goes according to plan. The conditions that military strategists assume when they draw their maps and calculate their odds almost never hold true in the chaos of actual combat. Equipment fails, intelligence proves wrong, timings slip, reinforcements never arrive. What determines the outcome of battles is not the quality of the planning. Though good planning matters, it is not the superiority of equipment, though superior equipment provides crucial advantages. What ultimately determines victory or defeat is the character of the soldiers who execute the plan, their ability to adapt when circumstances change, and their willingness to continue fighting when every logical calculation says they should give up. The Rangers who scaled those cliffs on June 6, 1944, possessed that character in abundance. They were not supermen. They were ordinary young Americans who had been forged into extraordinary soldiers through months of grueling training and the harsh filter of Ranger selection. Farmers and factory workers, students and store clerks, they came from every part of the country and every walk of life. What united them was not their backgrounds, but their determination, a shared refusal to be defeated that carried them up those cliffs and through 2 days of desperate combat. Today, more than 8 decades after the assault, the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc still rise above the English Channel, their faces scarred by the craters of bombardments that fell before most people now living were born. The waves still crash against their base, and the winds still howl across their summit. Visitors who make the pilgrimage to this sacred ground can stand where the Rangers stood, can look up at what they climbed, and can try to imagine what it must have been like to face such an obstacle under fire. Most cannot truly comprehend it. That is understandable. What the Rangers did at Pointe du Hoc was not meant to be comprehended by ordinary standards of human behavior. It was meant to be remembered honoured and never forgotten. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs.